Hey church, Jason here. Like many of you, I've been watching the news about violence between Israelis and Palestinians. And in spite of the recent ceasefire, I have felt fairly overwhelmed with both anger and sadness. I've been to that part of the world several times and have always been struck by the beauty of its people and the tragedy of its current situation. One of the most compelling experiences, one of the most convicting experiences I've had in life is to walk through Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem. You know, it's one thing to read about the evil of the Holocaust in a book, and it's another thing to be led through its history and artifacts by a Jewish person. And then after walking through such a painful story, then being brought to a high point overlooking the land, and to hear that Jewish guide talk about the modern state of Israel as a response to not just the Holocaust, but a history of anti-Semitic hate and violence that is seemingly as old as the Jewish people themselves. Violence that has escalated around the world and right here in the U.S. recently. I've toured bomb shelters in Sderot, a town near Gaza where Israelis live in constant fear of bombardment from rockets that Hamas launches on their homes and schools and playgrounds, and I've wondered how anyone could be so hateful, raining down such violence on innocent people. But these trips have exposed me to other stories too, including stories of Palestinians who have their own aspirations for safety and dignity in a land where their own roots run deep. These encounters have been really challenging for me because I've learned that I had blind spots and prejudices that have been shaped by my identity as an American, by growing up in evangelical spaces, by hearing only one predominant narrative in American media, and by not realizing that there are, in fact, many narratives in that land and among the people who call it home. These trips have been formative in my own understanding of what it means to follow Jesus in the way of peace for the sake of the world. And one of the bedrock principles I've learned in that process is to listen to people who are suffering, especially when I might have written off their story. And so today, I'd like us to hear a perspective that will be perhaps new for many. And it comes from Daniel Bannoura. Daniel is actually a member of our church family here in South Bend, but he's not from South Bend. He's from Palestine, born and raised there, and he's a Palestinian Christian. And he's got a perspective to share with us that might be different than one that you've heard before. So, church, I encourage you to really listen to Daniel. He's passionate, and he'll say things in this conversation that might be hard to hear, perhaps because they're in contrast to the narratives that you're familiar with. But that's exactly the kind of listening we're called to do, because Jesus calls us to the brave and difficult work of loving our neighbor, all of our neighbors, our Jewish neighbors, our Palestinian neighbors in this conflict, and to understanding the systems and structures that affect our neighbors. And Daniel has been born and raised in that context and has a very sharp perspective on those systems and structures. And he's been really gracious in sharing both his personal perspective with us and an opinion about those structures and systems so that we can grow in our understanding too. And so, church, as we try to continue to be learners and to follow Jesus in the way of peace, I'm grateful that we have this from Daniel and hope that you will listen in grace and peace. Daniel, welcome. Thanks for being with me today. A lot of us have been seeing some headlines about what's happening in the part of the world that you're from. But headlines are one thing and personal stories are another. And so you're a member of South Bend City Church, you're Palestinian, you're Christian. Those might be categories that people aren't very familiar with, frankly. So before we get into what's happening right now, could you tell us a little bit about who you are, where you've come from, your family roots, and what you're doing in South Bend?
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Jason. I'm happy to be here with you. So I am, like you said, I am Palestinian. I'm a Christian Palestinian Arab. I speak Arabic. That's my mother tongue. I'm a Christian, and I'll deal with that in a bit. And I'm a Palestinian. My national identity is a Palestinian. I speak Arabic because that's the lingua franca. That's the language that is spoken in the Middle East. And I kind of follow that kind of complicated history of the Middle East and what's been happening there. So I was born in Jerusalem, and I'm from Bethlehem. My family is from Bethlehem. I joke and say that I look like Jesus because I am from Bethlehem. So in case you see me in the street and you say, "Oh, this guy looks like Jesus," it's because I am from.
Especially with you healing people as you walk along and all that.
Exactly right, right. So I am from there, and kind of grew up in Bethlehem. Finished my studies back in Bethlehem, and then I moved to the U.S. Did my studies at the University of Florida. I have a bachelor's in science, in physics, and then had this kind of epiphany And I saw myself more interested in engaging with issues of faith and theology and philosophy and Islam as well. So pivoted from physics, did a master's in theology at London School of Theology in England, and then did a second master's in Islamic studies at the University of Chicago. Moved back to Palestine, to Bethlehem, worked on some small businesses and some kind of work in the local community. And now I'm back in the US, and now I'm doing my PhD studies in Quranic studies at the University of Notre Dame.
What's Quranic studies?
Yes, great. So that would be another podcast episode.
Yeah, fair. Yeah, never ask a PhD student what they're studying because you don't have time to hear the answer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We love talking about the stuff that we obsess about every day. But no, so the Quran is the holy text of Islam. So I read the text and engage with the history and the redaction of the Quran. Specifically, and I work with my advisor, Gabriel Said Reynolds, on what we call the biblical subtext of the Quran, which is the belief right now, which is kind of very persuasive right now with evidence that we have from the text itself, that the Quran came about in an environment, what we call a sectarian milieu, a world of Christianity and Judaism were both present and have influenced the formation, the theology, and even the collection of the Quran. So I'm interested in these questions about history of the text, about redaction of the text, and trying to make sense of this connection between the biblical tradition, the biblical literature, and the Quran, and how the Quran was influenced by the Christian and Jewish traditions that preceded Islam.
Daniel, you talk about being Palestinian and you speak Arabic. That's like your mother tongue. Is that right? A lot, maybe most Americans would be surprised then to hear you say that you're Christian. And so then they're wondering like, wait, did you recently convert? Because I thought Palestinians were Muslim. And so can you unpack that, your Christian identity and the roots of that?
Right. Yeah. So the Christian presence in the Middle East is authentic and as original as Christianity itself, right? So I'm not a convert. I wasn't a Muslim. My lineage goes back to the Church of Pentecost of Acts 2. So I've been a Christian. My family has been a Christian before, the pagan ancestors of, like Europeans became Christians. It's actually my ancestors who shared the gospel with your ancestors and they became Christians, right?
Yes.
So, Christianity is actually, is from there. It's an Eastern religion. Jesus was a Palestinian. I mean, he was a Jewish Palestinian, a Jew who lived in what is called a region called Palestine, and the church has continuously existed there in the land since then. A lot has changed throughout history, especially with the Islamic conquest to Palestine in the 7th century. Christians were a minority, and then they continued to live there. They became a minority by the 11th, 12th centuries, and then by the early 20th century, 10% of the Palestinian population was Christian. And we're talking about a very diverse and very beautiful kind of church community. And, it's the Holy Land. So like you have every denomination that is there. The vast majority is Orthodox and Catholic. And then I come from an Orthodox background, but also I became a Protestant. And there is a healthy kind of small minority within the minority that is Protestant, whether Lutheran, Presbyterian, Evangelical,
or whatever
Catholic.
Southland City Church is.
Right, exactly, right. So, I mean, it's the witness of Christ in His land has continued throughout the time. I'm Christian Palestinian, and that is normal, and that is part of that history of that region. And our confusion about that is only kind of based on ignorance and essentialization of the East, of the Middle East, and so on and so forth. But yes, it's a legacy that is beautiful, and Christians have continuously served and loved their community in Palestine and in the region as well. And they continue to be that kind of bridge between the East and the West. I speak the language of the Quran, of Islam, but also I believe in the Bible. And I believe in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, what Jews believe in. And I believe in the New Testament, and I'm a Christian like you. And so Middle Eastern Christians have continuously been that bridge. And it's unfortunate, it's sad that many Christians don't know that we exist. And even though I think we can play as Christians a huge role in connecting the Muslim world, the Arab world, the East, with the Christian world here in the West.
Yeah, and by the way, while we're talking about it, and this is a bit of a pivot, will you just share a little bit of how you found your way to South Bend City Church? We met at the baseball stadium last year. We were doing outdoor gatherings. I mean, you're in town, like you said, for grad school, but just give us a little bit on that before we get back to the issue at hand.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I applied to Notre Dame like in 2019. I got accepted to join the PhD program in early 2020. And then in like the summer, I was getting ready to move, and a friend recommended that I look into the church, South Bend City Church. And as a Palestinian, and we'll deal with this in the podcast now, part of the main reason for me that I joined South Bend, and the main reason that I wanted to be part of the church here, was the issue of social justice. And I was part of so many evangelical communities and churches that were disengaged from reality, and they kept talking about salvation and faith and so on, and personal kind of salvation, and ignored reality and on the ground. And especially during that time, the protests were happening in the US about George Floyd and systemic racism. And as a Palestinian, and as someone who really cares about the gospel, a gospel that is concerned about the weak and the poor, I wanted to find a church that concerns and deals with these issues and deals with these hard questions. So I just randomly listened to a podcast episode, and it's kind of funny that I'm on one right now.
That's right. That's right.
But then you were talking about, the church and how we respond to racism and so on. And also randomly you mentioned Palestine, Israel, and like you gave a story of you're listening to people there and like thinking about theology and how relevant theology is right now for us. And I'm like, well, hey, this is my church. Like this is the perfect, it's Christ-centered, concerned for the world, for social justice, for an authentic way to live and to follow Christ. And that was kind of it. Like I didn't even have to look anywhere else. I didn't go any church hopping or shopping, and I just kind of knew this would be my home for the next 5 years in South Bend.
Wow. Well, we're honored that you and Shannon are a part of this. So you mentioned that you were born in Jerusalem, grew up in Bethlehem, and your family, you got family, like that's still home for them. You're here for school, and you got married out here to an American woman. But tell us a little more about the place that you call home there in Palestine.
It's a beautiful place. It's funny when people ask me, oh, must be special to be from Bethlehem. What does it feel like to be from Bethlehem? And I'm like, it just feels like you being from South Bend. It's just home. But it's a beautiful place to be, and I encourage everyone who's listening, who's never been, to go and visit and see the place. There's a lot of complexity and beauty in that place, and also there's a lot of tragedy and hurt. But there's something so incredible about the society, with a very rich history, with a very rich folklore and food and religion and faith that is so complex and so beautiful. And this is a place that has been part of what we call the ancient Near East, or the ancient world, where actually civilization began. Talking about Egyptian, the pharaohs, they talk about the Babylonians, all of that, the Phoenicians and so on. All of these kind of civilizations kind of began in that region. So there's a lot of beauty there. So, my family owns a house that is like 300 years old,
wow,
which is like older than the US
yes,
is, right? But that's normal. That's
yes,
like nothing confusing or shocking or incredible about it.
Yep.
There's an added kind of layer that adds beauty or kind of significance to me when it comes to my understanding of Palestine, which is the issue of the conflict right now between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And this is where I kind of try to reflect on this theologically. There's a tendency, especially in the West, to pursue comfort and leisure and this kind of avoidance at all costs of any kind of pain and suffering, right? Like we have that prosperity, the technology, the comforts, the drive-thrus, our phones and so on. But there is this kind of suffering that is there because of the reality, because of being a minority, surrounded by majorities, the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So adds this layer of belonging, of an identity that is being challenged or even threatened many times. So, I feel like very closely to Palestine because of kind of the open wound I think we have as Palestinians, and particularly as Christian Palestinians, as a small minority within that kind of people group there.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about what gets loosely called the status quo of, and I'll say specifically like life where you grew up. And so this is like a little snapshot that I think is really kind of hidden from view for a lot of us in the West when we just read headlines, or maybe we've seen footage of life in Israel or a holy site in Jerusalem, but we don't really have any context for like life as a Palestinian growing up in Bethlehem with regard to occupation and walls and issues of citizenship and who has the power to determine what happens to Palestinians. This is a big question. Could you just describe a little bit of like, if you were to try to summarize, give us a snapshot of what you might call the status quo that you grew up in?
Yes, no, that's a great question. That, how much time do you have to address this issue?
Yeah.
And like books have been written, so many books have been written on this issue, and it's a complicated kind of history of the last 73 years. It is a complicated history, but also I want to emphasize, maybe later on we can discuss about the conflict and how complicated is the conflict, but I'll get back to that later maybe. But for me, when I think about the the latest kind of spat right now between Israel and Hamas, and I think about the whole kind of constant kind of violence that you see, and how here in the US how we perceive that, and you hear statements like, oh, there are always going to be fighting, or this is a struggle between Isaac and Ishmael for 3,000 years.
It's intractable and it's eternal.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's not, right? This is a very recent phenomenon. This began in the late 19th century with the rise of Zionism as a response to anti-Semitism in Europe, and then Jewish efforts to come and live in Palestine, or what they call the return to Palestine and to form their own Jewish state. And then World War II and the Holocaust, Palestinian and other Arab national movements that asserted their own kind of national identity and to form their own kind of like local identity after they have got ridden of colonial powers, meddling in their affairs, like the British and the French and what have you. And then the Holocaust happened, and there was a huge exodus of Jews out of Europe into Palestine. And eventually, in 1948, the Jewish state was established. Israel was established on May 14th of 1948, and that led to the kind of was the watershed moment of the beginning of the conflict between the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It depends how you want to view the conflict. For the Palestinian, it's a 70-year-old history of ethnic cleansing and of colonization of the Palestinian people, of their lands. A land that was called Palestine, that was home to Palestinian Muslims, to Palestinian Christians, to Palestinian Jews as well, suddenly became Israel. The vast majority of Palestinians today are refugees. Many of them were kicked out, were what we call ethnically cleansed from historic Palestine and became refugees. And we still have about 6 million refugees today, Palestinian refugees who still, most of them live in refugee camps and are not permitted to go back into their homeland. And that's kind of been the story of military conquest, of colonization of the Palestinian land, of the Palestinian identity, and continues today in the form of apartheid. And we can discuss this as well if you want to kind of engage with this issue of kind of the power dynamics that exist between the Jewish majority that is in power and between also the Palestinian and Arab kind of presence in the land. And it's a system of one ethnic people group that is in power and is dominating the other people group. And this has been considered by Palestinian and Israeli and even international human rights organizations as to be a system of apartheid, similar to the system that was in South Africa. So the spat of violence right now, we have to contextualize it. It's not eternal. It's not convoluted or complex. It's actually, for me, it's a very simple system of an oppressor and an oppressed, a colonizer and a colonized, or, as I said, it is a conflict between the sword and the neck, between a people that are being subdued and suppressed for 70 years and another people group that has been doing that to them. So that's how we have to understand what's been happening right now. So we should not be surprised or confused by the violence, and it's not that it is complicated. It is that we have chosen not to engage with it in a healthy and critical and nuanced way. And I think there's a lot of work that has to be done within the church body in the US, in the West, about engaging critically and objectively to engage with these issues.
So let's talk a little bit about what's been happening lately. I think for some people who maybe are like reading the news pretty deeply, that's one thing. I think a lot of people are probably just generally aware that there's been an increase in violence. They're aware that there's been airstrikes and rockets and that there's been strife. They might be aware that there's been mobs and beatings. I don't know. But could you kind of help us understand what's been going on in the last month? And maybe there's just moving through a few of the developments that have kind of taken us from what seemed kind of like things were quiet over there, and then all of a sudden it's in the headlines.
Yes, and that's kind of also, I think, something we have to pay attention to, that this becomes news whenever there is Palestinian violence, right? Whenever you hear of rockets being launched at Israel, that's when it makes it to the news here. And that is not what... That's not what just happened. There's a pretext to this. There's a context, like, and I mentioned this, the context of the violence and the conflict. And before Hamas attacked Israel, for the 3 weeks preceding that, there had been an important issue that is happening in Jerusalem, which is forced evictions of Palestinians living in East Jerusalem. Now, according to international law, forced evictions of individuals is a war crime. It's not permitted. And secondly, and this is a political issue, East Jerusalem is considered occupied. It's a Palestinian land territory that is occupied by the Israeli military. So any change to the status quo is unacceptable. It goes against UN resolutions and international law about the solution to the conflict. So when Israel is attempting to evict the Palestinians in this village, in this neighborhood, of Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, it's for the Palestinians, and I mentioned this earlier, it's one more example of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, of removing Palestinians and replacing them with Jewish settlers and so on. And that's kind of the thing. Just a few days ago, 4 days ago, we remembered what we call the Nakba, or the Palestinian catastrophe of 1948, of the eviction of the Palestinians. And for the Palestinians, it's not something that happened 73 years ago and it's over. For us, the Nakba, this ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, has been ongoing. And the precursor to all of the conflict right now is that the issue of ethnic cleansing and of forced evictions of the Palestinians in Jerusalem. Now, the result of that, the threat of evicting the Palestinian families there, led to this beautiful grassroots, non-violent protest, demonstrations everywhere in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, in Israel, by Palestinian Israelis who live in Israel. And there was just a beautiful kind of moment of solidarity between the Palestinians. How did Israel respond? You had Jewish settlers going to the streets, shouting death to the Arabs, shouting Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, is dead. Kind of these attacks, racist attacks on Muslim Palestinians. And then that escalated eventually at Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the holiest site in Palestine, the third most important site in all of Islam. And then the Israeli military attacks the Al-Aqsa Mosque, injured 300 worshippers at that holy site, and in a way provoked what's been happening now. Now it's not just civil disobedience or protests or a legal issue about house evictions. It's actually now an attack on Al-Aqsa Mosque, on the holiest site in Palestine for Muslims. That was a calculated measure made by Israel, by the Prime Minister of Netanyahu, to provoke Hamas. Hamas has been quiet about the demonstrations, has not been involved. This is a non-violent protest, not really kind of the spiel of Hamas. But Israel knew what it was doing. It has done this before. It has provoked Hamas before many times, and Netanyahu knew that this would happen. And that led to Hamas saying, if you do not leave Al-Aqsa Mosque, the compound, we're going to launch rockets. They gave them a deadline to Israel. Of course, Israel would never listen to Hamas. So Hamas said, okay, well, we're going to bomb Israel. And that kind of led to the context, to the conflict. And that's kind of the context. None of what I'm saying here is justification to what Hamas is saying, right? Like we need to talk about violence, and
let's call time out. Let me just unpack a couple context notes there, because that couple of things, I think Hamas and Al-Aqsa, just to give people a couple more handles on that, right? But so let's start there. So if people have seen pictures of Jerusalem, they might imagine that big golden dome that they may or may not know is also the Temple Mount, and that's the Dome of the Rock, which is in the same courtyard, right, as Al-Aqsa Mosque,
right next to
which, like you said, it's third holiest site in Islam, and it commemorates Muhammad's journey from the land of Saudi Arabia to the Mount, right, where he ascended to heaven briefly and came back down. So, point being, if you're looking for a place in the world that is tense with religious fervor, you've got the Temple Mount, which happens to be the same place. The Temple Mount for where Jews had their temple. Solomon's temple was built, and Herod's temple was built. Christians, of course, have a connection to that, the significance of that. And then at the same place, you have Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. So just for people, if you're trying to picture it, that's in the Old City in Jerusalem. Just an incredibly important place for all three of these traditions. And then Hamas, can you just explain to people who Hamas is and how they're part of this?
That's fair. I think that's very important. So Hamas is a militia group, and a militant group that functions in Palestine as one form of protest or resistance to the Israeli, like I said, colonization, ethnic cleansing of Palestine, right? So it was founded in 1988, which is 40 years after Israel was established. And it thinks right now that the Palestinians have been victimized, have been oppressed, have been violently attacked and killed and removed from their land. And as an oppressed people, they have every right to fight Israel through power. And the saying is, power can only be defeated by power, or violence can only be defeated by violence. Now, of course, I disagree with this. This is not the way of the cross. This goes against my Christian faith. But for an oppressed people, they think any form of resistance is legitimate. And this is for them, it's guaranteed by international law about the oppressed resisting and fighting against oppression. So, and this kind of deals, we can engage with the issues of violence. Can violence be redemptive? How do you respond to the powerful and the mighty? What if someone attacks your house? Can you shoot at that person, right? So there is a lot of conversation about just war, about violence. But, of course, there's a huge problem with that. And I think it doesn't really help the cause, because I think the Palestinian cause is a just cause. It's grounded in international law and human rights and dignity and worth and values like liberty and sovereignty that are very fundamental to any person. So the Hamas, as a militant religious movement, kind of sees itself within that larger context of Palestinian resistance, which is largely nonviolent, but finds itself to be at the forefronts against a very belligerent, aggressive, militant state. Israel is the only nuclear power in the Middle East. It's the strongest military in the region. It is like David and Goliath fighting, but for Hamas and for other militant groups, fighting back is the only legitimate and honorable thing for them to do. Otherwise, they would cower. They would be defeated. So that's the context of what Hamas is. However, this is kind of the problem with Hamas, is especially in the media in the US, and there's so much that we have to say about this, and the bias that is very implicit and very obvious in the media, in the political discourse in Washington. Hamas is only a small faction of the Palestinian larger resistance movement, right? We fight in different ways. For the most part, our resistance is nonviolent, and it's a beautiful resistance. But unfortunately, we have to deal with this kind of bias that exists in the world, and especially in the West, and can engage with this. But my plea and my hope for all of us to, think of this contextually, to understand what Hamas is doing, not in isolation. And also there's a danger of us being very racist towards the Palestinians by focusing on Hamas so much. Because we're saying the Palestinian suffering doesn't matter. What matters is that Hamas is an embodiment of the Palestinian story, and they're violent, they're inherently violent, they're out to get the Jews, and there's a bit of kind of this racist attitude that kind of comes into it without any regard or any kind of sympathy or empathy with the suffering, with the continuous trauma and the open wound of the Palestinians for the last 70 years. So we have to unpack all of this as we think about these issues.
You used a hard word there, right, when you say racism, and I just want to I think help people with that, because I hear what you're saying, and I think that's the right word to use. But I just kind of want to observe what you just said, right? That's so there's a people group, the Palestinians, and if the move is to kind of judge or characterize a people group based on the behavior of one one element within this much larger tapestry of people and behaviors. Racism is probably the right word for that, right? Like, you know, when, say a country, like a Western country, with a bunch of white people in it, when somebody within that country or some group within that country does something violent or unjust or bad, like most of us don't use that to then extrapolate like a judgment on, say, that whole country or those people. But when it's another group, especially a marginalized group, to do that, to kind of say like, well, Hamas, I have a view of their behavior, and then that becomes my judgment on Palestinian people as a whole, and then Palestinians are suspect, Palestinians are terrorists, Palestinians are these things. That's the right word for it, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, there's a lot to be done there. So when you think about racism in the U.S. and you think about the stereotypes that existed in American society, and even preceding America, like when you think about the history of colonization of the Americas and how the Native Americans were conceived as to be savages, to be violent. I was reading a book the other day, and in the church itself, they would not permit the converted natives to become, they won't allow them to become priests because they don't have a grasp of Latin, because they're savage, you know, because they can't really perceive and understand theology well because they come from that savage roots. So, you know, that's, you know, think about racism right now when we think about the black culture, about when we discuss issues like violence in the black community or, you know, single parenthood and all these things. And you hear this frequently, this black culture that is lazy, that is prone to violence, that is uneducated. And all of this is these are like stereotypes, right, and have been used historically, whether during slavery, Jim Crow laws, and so on, to perpetuate this power dynamics between the powerful and then the oppressed, the blacks. So that's kind of where this essentialization of the other, this reduction of the agency, of the power, of the intellect, of the feelings and the experiences and the trauma of these people. So yeah, that's part of it. You know, so when you think of Arabs, when you think of Muslims, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And like if, you know, like what is the difference? What do you see? Do you see people like on camels? Do you see people like blowing up stuff? If that's what you're seeing, there's something that you have to do, some unlearning we have to do. So there's a lot of that is happening there, that refuses to see the other who is violent, who is different, to see him, to see her, to see him with value, with worth, to see them as complex characters, you know, like in a novel, in a good novel, where they have so many things that impact the way they perceive the world.
Yes. Yeah. When we preach, you know, one of our mantras is everyone an icon.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. When we preach that, we have these kind of litmus tests about othering, because othering is one of the ways that we fail to live up to that mantra, right? And some of those questions that we've asked ourselves as a church are things like, well, like you might be othering a person or a group if you don't assume that they have a story, right? You might be othering a person or a group if you don't grant them the same complexity and nuance that you grant somebody like you, right? And then to overcome some of that is to begin to imagine and learn about the complexity and the stories and the nuances that are part of the people that you would have othered. And like a lot of the opportunity that you're giving us today, Daniel, is to do some of that work with how we think about the Palestinian experience. And I just want to call out, I think my hunch is that for some listeners, a lot of what you've said already feels pretty overwhelming, surprising. Yeah. It can be a little bit like stepping into a different world when you hear a narrative different than the one that you've gotten accustomed to about what's happening in Israel and Palestine, or about what's happening in the news. So I'll just say to our listeners and like our church family, like if you're feeling a little like, whoa, yeah, that's kind of what happens sometimes when you discover that there's another perspective in some of these experiences, especially when you're a citizen of the richest, most powerful country in the world. It might be surprising to find out that the way that we narrate the order of the world and the empires that run the world, that there's another way to understand these things that might be truer, but it can be really disorienting if all you've kind of seen and heard is from the perspective of power and privilege, right?
Yeah, and that's a good point. So like taking this back to what's happening right now in Gaza.
Yep.
You know, like today, as of yesterday.
Sorry, let's back up. Gaza is
Oh.
that little strip right along the Mediterranean that butts up against Egypt, right? And people may or may not track the Palestinian territory. Forgive me, I want to make sure I use words that honor how you would name this. But Gaza and the West Bank are those two different parts of the land that are both ostensibly Palestinian controlled, but you can correct me on that.
Yeah, define control.
Yeah.
So, two-state solution. This fanciful idea that the land can be split into two different countries, Israel and Palestine. And the international consensus right now is that Palestinians could have a state in what is called the West Bank, which includes my hometown, Bethlehem, Hebron, East Jerusalem, and other cities, and also a strip on the Mediterranean Sea, the same size as it's a very small area, I think like 100 kilometers in length. Actually, I need to correct that, but I'm not really certain about the numbers right now. But it's a very small area,
Yep.
and that would be the Palestinian state, right? So that's kind of what we think about the two-state solution. Now, when it comes to how viable is this? How can you have a state that is divided by a different state? There's a conversation to be had about one-state solution, a binational federation, or two-state solutions. But anyway, this is the international consensus right now, agreed upon by the Palestinians and the U.S., but of course still rejected by the Israeli military forces. Now Hamas is functioning from that Gaza Strip. And has been launching rockets at Israel. Israel has been launching rockets, bombing all of Gaza. Right now, 227 Palestinians have been killed. 63 of those are children. About 35 of those are women. So about 50% of those who were killed in Palestine right now in Gaza are children and women.
And that's just in this recent conflagration of the last few weeks?
The last 2 weeks,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
50% of those who died are women and children. That doesn't mean that the men are all militant or complicit.
We don't want men dying either.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And many of those died. You see reports of journalists being killed. You see reports of 2 doctors have been killed so far. One of them is like a 66-year-old prominent doctor in the Gaza Strip. Also, if some of these were militants, so therefore we just kill them, and that's we talked about the icon. Do they have worth? Can they defend themselves? Is there any kind of due process? But no. And that's and I want to bring this back to the issue of racism that you mentioned. It is okay to bomb Hamas and militants because they are militants, right? But how racism becomes a problem is when you have all of this suffering, when this mass destruction of property, of lives, the hospitals in Gaza are being destroyed. The only COVID clinic in Gaza was destroyed. And then when you have the conversation, you want to have a civilized, reasonable, charitable conversation, and you want to point out, hey, kids are dying, and the only response is to shift the conversation, to pivot from that opportunity to be empathetic, to feel suffering, and to stand for the weak, for the dispossessed, for the hurting, and to shift that and to start pointing fingers at Hamas. Even though the rocket that fell killed, for example, a few days ago, a rocket fell and killed 10 individuals, 8 children, and 2 women in one family. And when you take that and you ignore it and ignore that horrendous crime, and then pivot to blaming Hamas, that's kind of where the racism is, right? These Palestinians don't have worth, right? They're just, as if they're cattle. We don't care about them. We don't want to sit in the pain, in the empathy, and in our love towards that pain. And what happened, we want to point the finger. So that's kind of where racism seems to be implicit. And the more we talk about Hamas, the more we're ignoring the real tragedy of the suffering in Gaza and the illegal blockade of Gaza and the terrible conditions that the Gazans are living in because of a long siege and blockade over Gaza.
Yeah, thanks for unpacking that. A lot of people listening might be thinking, wait, I thought there's a theological mandate for how we think about Israel as a modern nation state. I remember some of the Sunday school classrooms that I grew up in. I didn't really understand what they were saying, but I do remember teachers talking about, forming of Israel, and they had a theory about how that connected to the book of Revelation and stuff like that. I don't want to actually like try to go too far in that direction. I just want to call out, some people probably heard that kind of stuff. But I do want to think with you about like, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus in relationship to what you just described, both for Americans like me and for a Palestinian like you, to think a little bit about, well, then what would Jesus call us to in terms of how we think about this, and even beyond how we think about it, whether we act on it and whether we do anything.
Yeah.
So, where do you want to go there?
Yeah, so many things to unpack right now. So the fundamental issue right now is what does the Bible teach us when it comes to these issues of violence and conflict? And I take my law, I take my teachings from the Sermon on the Mount, right? To be peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are thirsty and hungry for righteousness, or could be understood to mean justice. Blessed are those who are hungry and thirsty for justice. And the proclamation of the gospel, it's a gospel, it is good news for everyone, particularly those who suffer, those who are in pain. And that ministry of Christ on earth was this beautiful incarnation, that God himself would transcend into our lives, into our suffering, and engage in that suffering and transform that suffering into life, into victory, and so on. And Jesus begins his ministry in Luke 4, where he proclaims that he has come to reveal and give liberty to the oppressed. In Matthew 24, he says, if you do not clothe the naked, if you do not visit those in prison, if you do not feed the hungry, then you have rejected me. Then you are the Antichrist. Then you are against Christ himself. Because if you didn't do it to the least of these, you haven't done it to me. You were against me. So that's this doesn't take anything from the spiritual element of salvation. And I think the gospel is holistic. And we need to understand the holistic mission of God on earth, right? It is our souls, it's our salvation, but it's also our bodies. And Christ is redeeming all of it. All of creation is being redeemed. Personally, socially, environmentally, politically, all of this stuff is being redeemed through Christ. So that's the foundation, theological foundation. Even if you go before Christ and go to the prophetic tradition, Micah 6:8, what does the Lord require of you, O man, is to do justice, to love mercy. You see the prophetic tradition on Isaiah, but this transformation of society, of swords becoming plowshares, right? Of lion and the lamb laying together. And you see that, that justice would roll like a tide, and this is kind of influence a lot, Dr. King here in the US as well. So there is that very essential kind of grounding theologically and ethically of how we think about issues of justice and issues of violence and issues of peacemaking. So that's kind of the foundation, that we care for the poor and the suffering, and then we ground that in a theological understanding that pursues justice, that pursues of the energy and the power to put things right as they should be in a state of equity and equality and justice. So that's I think the ethical grounding that we have to function within, the gospel message and the prophetic tradition. Now, what makes this issue particularly a messy one is the issue of Zionism and the issue of anti-Semitism. Zionism, which is this theology, Christian Zionism particularly, that sees the land today of Palestine belongs to the Jewish people. God has given them the land. And that is something that we have to discuss as a church body, as a body of Christ, of how if we understand the work of Christ, how we understand the Jewish people. What does the land mean today, and what does the land function as today? So there's a lot of conversation that has to be had, and I'm happy to talk about it with you as well. And there's an issue of anti-Semitism, right? There's that historical animosity towards the Jewish people by the church, and the church has been complicit in the suffering and injustice towards the Jewish people. And so all of these things have to be dealt with. And my problem is that when I talk about Palestine, I can hear it now. People listening to me right now, this is what they're thinking about. They're thinking about anti-Semitism, and they're thinking about how they read the scriptures. So these have to be unpacked, and we can deal with them right now. But whatever our theology is, whatever we conceive, how we understand history, how we understand the biblical promises, and so on in the Old Testament, and how they have been fulfilled in Christ, our theology has to be an ethical theology. It is that seeks the wellness and the well-being and the an abundant life for all people, for the Jewish people, for the Palestinian people, and we should not turn a blind eye about the suffering of the Jewish people, or that 12 Israelis were killed in the latest attack. And these kids and these Israelis have worth and have dignity and carry the icon, the image of God, just like the Palestinians. So whatever our theology is, it has to be constructed based on an ethical principle of the image of God that gives worth and dignity to the Palestinian child in Gaza, to the Jewish Israeli child in Ashkelon or in Israel.
Yes. Yeah. And this might be helpful for people to as a starting point on the whole, what about geopolitical events in the Bible and readings of Revelation and stuff like that. Just to call out that, like, sometimes I feel like I see people trying to do the complicated theological math, and maybe they've heard a preacher who pulled a verse out of Daniel or Revelation and tried to correlate it to some modern events, and then they think that leads them to pick a side in this fight. And the side they think that means they have to pick is Israel because of this a certain version of a biblical theology, although my card's on the table. I don't know that it's actually very good interpretation.
Yeah, no, I
but,
agree.
Yeah, but so I think a lot of people have seen that and gone through that. That's where they're starting from when they try to think theologically about this. But what's really helpful to me is because sometimes the theological math can be complicated, right? You're like, wait, how does it all connect? It's a big, complicated book, the Bible. There's a lot of different opinions and views. But what I love is that Jesus gives us this clarifying filter when asked how to read the law. And he says that to love God and to love your neighbor is the fulfillment of the law, which to me, like, I can start with, like, well, whatever my politics, whatever my theology, whatever my biblical interpretation, if it leads to a lack of love for my neighbor, I got my math wrong. I got to go back and reconfigure it, right? Because like if I end up with a worldview or a posture, or if I end up preaching something, or if I end up doing something, or even voting in a way that hurts my neighbor, that I probably need to go back and ask whether I got the theology right. Because Jesus seems to be saying, if you're doing your theology right, it will end up with love for your neighbor, right? And then I think about that person who asked Jesus, well, who's my neighbor? Which is this classic, like, attempt to put a limiting principle on the law, right? To say, like, well, I want to know which categories of persons I'm required to love, which is, to me, that othering, that impulse inside us that wants to divide the human race and say, these are the people I really am expected to love and whose well-being I have to care about, which means there's other people who I'm not expected to love and whose well-being is not my problem. And Jesus tells a frustrating story that really doesn't satisfy the person asking the question, I think, right? Because Jesus basically just creates a character in the parable of the Good Samaritan. The person in need of love and help in this story is just kind of generic, right? I mean, we actually don't learn a lot about the kind of person I'm called to love. And then Jesus flips the script on the person and raises up a Samaritan who would have been a complicated hero for a Jewish audience. And then asks the person, well, who was a neighbor to the one in need? As if to say, you're asking, who should I love? And I'm just asking, will you be the one who loves? Right? I just see Jesus dismantling all these impulses around, well, like, who am I supposed to care about and whose side are we on? And I think if you follow Jesus's line of thought there, you can leave behind some of the complicated end times theology stuff. You can leave behind some of the twisted interpretations, and you could just ask, who is in need? Who is hurting? Where are power structures that have been built that keep people down? And what does it mean to love those people and to wish for their well-being? Does that track with you?
Right, no, for sure. And I think the obsession of many Christians with eschatology, with the end times, has led them to justify violence. And then, if the Palestinians are fighting Israel, therefore they're standing against God's plans for the Jewish people, and Jesus is going to return on the Mount of Olives, therefore the Jews have to be in control, therefore they're opposing God. And I've heard this like to my face, that I'm standing in God's purposes against God's purposes in the land, and I need to leave so that Jewish people would come, so that Christ would come back. So eschatology, fascination, obsession with prophecy fulfillments has been a tool to justify and turn a blind eye on my suffering. And not just my suffering, the suffering of the church, the body of Christ in Palestine, that the church itself, the witness of Jesus in the land for the last 2,000 years, is now an obstacle to God. And you see Christians, your brothers and sisters, siding with the oppression and ethnic cleansing and the hurt and the violence at the expense of the Palestinian Christians, at the expense of the church in Palestine. And this is a very odd thing. Like me as a Palestinian Christian, I'm not suffering from Muslims. And this is a very unique thing, I think, in the region, that the main cause of my suffering as a Palestinian Christian is caused by Jewish Israelis, and who are given impunity and giving support and funding and money by the church, especially in the US. That Christians are given millions of dollars annually to support Israel. I can talk about American politics as well, and how many billions of dollars annually are given to the military through our tax dollars. And that's kind of the thing that all of this is based on, a lot of it is based on how we understand eschatology and the end times. And if our end times theology is causing us to be like this, blind to suffering, and to even stand against the body of Christ in his land, there's a huge problem with this theology, and we better get rid of it quickly. We better examine ourselves and understand that this theology is not just something you read in a book. This theology influences the lives and the dignity of the body of Christ, and also millions of people living in Palestine, Israel.
I remember my first trip to the region, I was just overwhelmed. Actually, I have this journal from that trip somewhere, and I wrote over and over again in my journal, theology has consequences.
Right.
I just saw that so painfully clear in a way that I had been naive about before I went to a place in the world where really American Christian theology gets exported and weaponized. And it was a really profoundly humbling thing to just see that, like, what might feel like a dorm room conversation, like a fun, like, theoretical thing to kick around, whether it's eschatology, which, by the way, friends, that's kind of a big word for, like, the end times. Anyway, these conversations can seem theoretical or like a hobby, and then you go to a place in the world where people are dying because we're doing bad theology. I think that's really true. People are dying because we're doing bad theology.
Right. Yeah. And then you see, so you mentioned the Good Samaritan, right? That my neighbor is anyone, right, who I see at the side of the road. You go to Galatians 3. There's no difference between Jew and Gentile, right? Male or female, all are one in Christ Jesus. And that chapter is very important in the way we understand prophecies and fulfillment, that the true sons of Abraham are those who are of faith. Not the seed of Abraham is not an ethnicity. It's actually those who are the faith of Abraham, who was not a Jew, but who believed in God, and it was considered as righteousness to him. And therefore, if we belong to Christ, we are sons of Abraham and heirs according to the promise. So there's a shift that is moving us from a very ethnocentric / racist theology that sees one people is privileged into this beautiful, inclusive theology that's saying anyone could be received, anyone could be son of Abraham, and anybody could inherit the land. The meek inherit the land, right? In Matthew 5. And Jesus said, and Paul says this again in Matthew, Paul in Matthew. Ephesians 2, he's talking about Christ destroying this wall of enmity that separated Jew from Gentile. There's this beautiful, inclusive gospel that is good news to everyone, good news to you as a white American, good news to me as a Palestinian Christian, good news to the Jewish person as well. And that and that for me is the gospel, right? That is actually good news. So if any part of our theology that isn't good news, it's not the gospel. It is actually against the gospel, because it's not being good news to a lot of people. And this, touches on the issue of racism, right? Like in American history, and, touches on the issue of Palestine, Israel as well. So we have to, I think the church has to repent. There's a lot of repenting we always have to do, but we especially have to repent on this continual kind of support of violence. And we've done it continuously, whether it's with sexism, whether with racism in the church. We read the book, The Color of Compromise, at the church as well. So and then Palestine, Israel is one more lesson we still have to learn. We haven't learned the lesson of the Holocaust. The lesson of the Holocaust was that we should not oppress and victimize people based on their ethnicity. This is still happening. We haven't learned the lesson of apartheid South Africa, that you cannot separate people, put them in ghettos and Pantustan system like in South Africa. We're still doing it right now, and the church has not learned the lesson yet. And it's just unfortunate. It's sad that we have such a beautiful tradition. We have a beautiful Christ who shows us the way to live and formulate our ethics and theology, but we're still messing up. And the church still today is complicit in the suffering of the church in Palestine, and also in the suffering of all Palestinian people.
So, Daniel, you've given us the privilege of actually hearing from you as a brother. I just want to call out again that there's real trauma and real emotional labor here. These are people you know, people who've died. Even this is not theoretical for you. So you've given us a real gift just by sharing and by using your voice to speak into our church. I think those of us who are listening, then what we owe then is to not just hear, but to do, right? Now, that being said, like, people are going to be coming from all different places, and for some, just listening to this podcast will be a really intense labor. These are new ideas or new perspectives. But can you help, if you picture just the average person listening, and maybe they're like, I want to do something. I want to take a step. I want to grow in the direction of love for the neighbor, and especially justice for the oppressed. Could you kind of point us in a couple directions, maybe?
Right. Yeah. So before we develop a white messiah complex,
never happens.
Right. Before we try to say, well, let me go and fix it.
Yeah.
First, we need to recognize our complicity in what's happening, right? Whether it's our willful ignorance and apathy towards what's happening, whether it's our bad theology, we have to learn and unlearn a lot of things. We have to deconstruct. We have to reread the text. But also, we're complicit in the suffering of the Palestinian people and the convoluted struggle between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and also hurting also the Jewish Israelis as well, through the unwavering, unconditional support of the state of Israel. Every year, $3.7 billion go to Israel as in the form of rockets. So the bombs that are falling now on Gazans, the 63 kids that were killed by American rockets paid for by American tax dollars. So it's not that we are the benevolent, loving Americans who are trying to save the world. We're actually complicit in what's happening there. And it's not just Palestine, it's also Yemen, what's happening in Yemen. It's also Iraq, it's also Syria, Afghanistan. Unfortunately, this is a beautiful and great country, but also this country has been guilty of a lot of mistakes and problems. So there is something that has to be done. It's not that I want to be benevolent and help. I have an active role to play in rectifying and fixing this problem. So that's where we have to start, to recognize our complicit and implicit and apathetic involvement in this. Whether I like it or not, I am playing a role in this. So now, how do we go from there? Should not wallow in self-pity and feeling badly or guilty about it? Okay, well, what can we do? How can we rectify this? First, we have to develop a theology that is based on compassion, that is based on a Christ-centered approach to suffering and to violence, that takes violence upon itself, doesn't inflict violence. It takes violence, it embraces violence, and it transforms violence into life, right? Christ walked towards the cross, and we have to walk alongside him, and to find in suffering and to find in violence a tool for us to transform into life and into wholeness. We have to care for the least of these. We have to care for the oppressed. This is the whole incarnation, is God leaving his throne to be with us unworthy scum. And that's the core of the gospel, and that's what makes the gospel so attractive. That's why I'm a Christian, because of the incarnation, because that unconditional love for the least of these. And then we have to, before we try to solve problems, we have to educate ourselves. We have to understand how our theology, how our biases influence the way we perceive the world. we need to understand the context of the conflict, and we talked about this frequently, to understand the whole legacy of 73 years. Admittedly, like, my perspective is a Palestinian perspective. There's also an Israeli perspective of pain, of suffering, of idea of returning and being empowered after being victimized. We need to hold that and honor that as well. But as we do that, let's honor also the Palestinian story of hurt, of trauma, and kind of conceive of a new reality, and work towards that reality. But that has to start with education, with learning, with being quiet for a bit and listening. Amplify Palestinian voices. Listen to the Jewish side of the story. Listen to, uncomfortable truths. And you mentioned the being uncomfortable. Normalize that discomfort, right? Like, sit in that discomfort and ask yourself, why am I uncomfortable right now? And then try to say, this is why. Let me try to fix this. Let me try to work on this. Let me try to work on myself first before I can move forward. Now, when it comes to involvement, there's a lot that you can do. You can start by prayer. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem, right? This is in the text. But then you can do a lot of work. You can try to find creative ways to support the Christian Palestinian community. You can write, you can speak, you can send letters to your representatives. You can, most importantly, perhaps, is to stand alongside those who suffer, whether through your advocacy, whether it's through your finances, whether through coming and living there and like using your talents and your skills. And we say this all the time: come and see, come to the Holy Land, and come to Palestine, Israel, meet the Palestinian Christians, meet the refugees in refugee camps, meet with the Jewish Israeli population as well, and get to hear their perspective, and then develop a healthy and God-honoring approach, and then act upon it. And I think you need to. Yeah.
Speaking of, going over there and hearing and seeing, this is just me speaking up for our church and just saying, like, having had that opportunity 3 or 4 times now to go over to the land, and having been really plunged into different encounters with Palestinians, with different perspectives among Palestinians, and Israeli Jews with different perspectives among themselves too. And I just think, like, it's so easy to think that this is just like one side versus another side, or that like there's a monolithic Israeli perspective and a monolithic Palestinian perspective. And you've just begun to kind of demonstrate that that's not really fair, right? That there's actually a lot of different perspectives on the ground over there.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
that,
I mean, sorry.
I think that's really helpful to call out, because, like, I've sat with a lot of Israeli Jews in Israel who hate what their government does in terms of policy around their Palestinian neighbors. This isn't quite as simple as like all the Israelis want one thing, all the Palestinians want another. And I find a lot of people that I've been ushered into encounters with on both sides of the wall, literally, who are really quite desperate to see something different happen there. And where they see that their own well-being is wrapped up with their neighbor's well-being, especially when the neighbor is other than them, in terms of race or nationality. So anyway, I just like, I know the last hour or so might have been a lot of unexpected perspective for people. And if I can, like, put on the pastor hat and just be like, church, this is part of what we do. We listen and we learn and we humble ourselves, and we open ourselves to the possibility that how we see things is not the way they are. And so you've given us a chance to do a little bit of that today, and I'm really grateful. And church, like, we'll keep doing these things as a community. Like, you're not on your own. We're a family, and as a family, we will, day after day, week after week, year after year, figure out how Jesus is calling us to enact our love for people and to pursue justice in the world. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, maybe that's a little bit good, because maybe that's humbling, but also, like, we're not going to fix anything overnight. We're going to take steps that we can take as we take them. Any final word you want to give us, Daniel?
No, thank you so much for having me. And I appreciate what you just said. And fundamentally our job as a body of Christ is to be engaged in the work of reconciliation, right? In the work of Christ, and going about that business of redemption, of restoration, of making the person whole. And that is like so fundamental, but so hard for us. And we got caught up in so many different things that distract us from doing that. So yeah, I mean, this is kind of my call to the body of Christ, to the church, whether South Bend City Church or anyone else who's listening, is to be that person who's all about that business of healing, of dealing with trauma, of dealing with peacemaking in an active, proactive, constructive way, and really like kind of develop that heart of Jesus that breaks for those who are hurting, and who imagines with the prophets a new reality of nations putting their swords down and cultivating a beloved community that has to and needs to exist in Palestine as well, especially right now as people are dying as we're speaking. So thank you for having me, and I'm hopeful that this conversation would lead to many more conversations, and to be challenged and to be hard pressed to be Christ in the world that desperately needs him.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, brother.
Mm-hmm.